3 days after my sister's wedding, my mother called me 11 times in a row. I let it go to voicemail every single time because 3 days earlier, that same woman had stood in a hotel lobby and told me I wasn't welcome inside. My name is Carmen Donovan. I'm 32 years old, and by the time my mother finally got me on the phone, she wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling because the wedding venue in Savannah, Georgia, had just frozen $38,000 in vendor payments, and somehow my family needed that fixed within 48 hours. It started 2 weeks earlier when my mother, Susan, pulled me aside at a family lunch. "Carmen," she said, not quite looking at me, "we think it's best if you don't come to the wedding." I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just nodded because some part of me had been waiting years for them to finally say out loud what they'd always meant. What none of them knew was exactly whose signature was already on that venue contract. Or what would happen the moment I stopped answering the phone. I'm not going to tell you what I said when my mother finally reached me. Not yet. You need to understand what 3 days of silence actually cost my family first. But before I take you back, do something for me. If you've ever been uninvited from something you were quietly paying for, hit subscribe right now. It takes 2 seconds and it tells me you're still here with me. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every one. Because in about 45 minutes, you're going to hear exactly what I said to my mother when she finally admitted out loud why she was calling. For now, let's go back to where it started. A house outside Savannah, Georgia, where I learned early that my sister got the invitations and I got the bills. Growing up outside Savannah, Georgia, meant growing up in a house where my sister Rachel was the son, and I was something closer to the furniture. Youthful. Reliable. Rarely looked at directly. Rachel was born 4 years before me, and from the earliest memory I have, the household organized itself around her. My mother, Susan, ran a small event planning business out of our home, coordinating weddings and anniversary parties for families across Chatham County. My father, Gerald, managed a hardware store downtown. We had enough money to be comfortable, but not enough for 2 daughters to have equal amounts of everything. In our house, that math always resolved the same way. Rachel got the everything. I got what was left. When Rachel wanted dance lessons at 8 years old, my parents found the money within a week. When I asked for the same lessons 2 years later, my mother told me dance wasn't really my thing, and suggested I try reading instead, since I was the smart one. I didn't understand yet that being called the smart one was often just a nicer way of being told you'd get less. I learned early to stop asking for things. By 10, I'd started doing chores around the neighborhood, walking dogs, watering plants for an elderly couple 2 houses down, just so I'd have money that was mine that nobody could decide I didn't deserve. By 12, I had over $300 saved in an envelope taped to the underside of my dresser drawer. My mother found it once while cleaning and asked where it came from. When I told her, she said, "Well, aren't you resourceful?" in a tone that made it clear she found it slightly embarrassing rather than admirable. Rachel, at the same age, received a $50 weekly allowance for doing essentially nothing. Family dinners were their own ritual of imbalance. My father would ask Rachel about her friends, her cheerleading squad, her latest drama, and she'd talk uninterrupted for what felt like half the meal. When my turn came, if it came, I'd get a quick "how's school" before the conversation drifted back to Rachel. I stopped bringing up things that mattered to me. When I made the honor roll for the 4th consecutive semester in 8th grade, my mother's response was, "That's great, honey. Did you hear Rachel got asked to homecoming by a junior?" I didn't hate Rachel. I want to be honest about that from the start, the same way I've always tried to be honest about my brother in situations like this. Rachel wasn't cruel to me directly. She simply existed in a world where she'd never had to notice that other people existed with equal needs, because our parents had never once required her to notice. She floated. I worked. That was simply the architecture of our house, built long before either of us had any say in it. By 16, I had a part-time job at a bookstore in downtown Savannah, and I'd started quietly building a savings account my parents didn't fully know the size of. I got accepted into an advanced placement program in economics that same year, a genuinely competitive opportunity with only 12 spots in the entire school district. My mother's response when I told her was, "That's nice. Rachel's going to prom with the quarterback, can you believe it?" I stopped waiting for a different reaction after that. I simply accepted that my accomplishments would always be background noise in a house that had already decided where the spotlight belonged. The clearest example came my senior year, when I was accepted into a well-regarded business program at a university 3 hours away, with a partial merit scholarship covering about half my tuition. The same month, Rachel, then 22, announced she was engaged to her college boyfriend, Kyle, and asked our parents for help with a small, tasteful wedding. My parents threw an engagement party that cost, by my private calculation later, close to $4,000. Nobody threw me anything when my acceptance letter arrived. My mother mentioned it briefly to a neighbor as, "Carmen's off to college too," in the same sentence as talking about Rachel's cake tasting. I want to be clear that I wasn't invisible because I lacked achievements. I had them. I simply had them in a house that had already decided, long before I earned anything, that achievements weren't the currency it valued in me. In Rachel, charm and likability were treated as inherent gifts worth celebrating. In me, achievement was treated as expected, unremarkable, the bare minimum of what a smart daughter should produce without complaint or applause. By the time I left for college, I'd developed two things that would define the next decade of my life. The first was a fierce, quiet independence, an instinct to build things for myself without waiting for permission or acknowledgement. The second was an unusually sharp eye for numbers, contracts, and fine print, developed from years of managing my own small savings and eventually helping my mother's event planning business untangle vendor invoices during summer breaks, back when she still occasionally let me help. I didn't know it yet, but that second skill was going to become the single most important thing I ever learned in that house. Nobody at that dinner table had any idea what either of those traits would eventually mean for them. I certainly didn't yet either. The breaking point didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in layers over the course of one spring 5 years ago when I was 27. By then I'd graduated, built a career in contract management, and moved into my own apartment in Charleston, about 2 hours from my parents' house outside Savannah. I'd kept a respectful distance from my family for years by that point, visiting on major holidays, calling every couple of weeks, but never fully re-entering the dynamic that had shaped my childhood. Rachel had married Kyle 3 years earlier in a wedding I attended and, unbeknownst to most of the family, had quietly helped pay for after a vendor dispute threatened to derail it 2 weeks before the date. Nobody outside my parents knew that. I hadn't wanted credit. I just wanted the day to go smoothly for my sister, and some old habit in me still equated being useful with being loved. That spring, my mother called and asked if I'd help again. Rachel and Kyle were struggling financially, and my parents wanted to help them buy a starter home outside Atlanta. Would I be willing to co-sign a portion of a personal loan, just to help the numbers work? I said no. It was the first time in my life I'd said no to a direct request like that, and the silence on the phone afterward told me exactly how unfamiliar that word was to my mother when it came from me. 2 weeks later, at a family dinner I'd driven 2 hours to attend, my mother brought it up again in front of everyone, framing my refusal as selfishness. "Your sister needs a home for her family, Carmen. You've always been so independent. Surely you can help this once." I explained calmly that I'd already helped with the wedding, that I had my own financial goals, and that co-signing a loan for a couple with unstable income was not a small ask. My father said nothing. Rachel looked at her plate. Kyle looked irritated. My mother said, quietly but audibly enough for the whole table to hear, "I just don't understand why you have to make everything about you." That sentence stayed with me for weeks. Everything about me. As if declining to take on someone else's financial risk was some kind of narcissism, rather than the most basic form of self-preservation. The actual breaking point came a month later. I'd been dealing with a difficult breakup, and for the first time in years I called my mother, genuinely needing to talk to someone, needing, honestly, just a parent. She listened for about 4 minutes before pivoting the conversation to Rachel, who was, apparently, having a difficult week adjusting to married life. My mother spent the next 20 minutes discussing Rachel's stress, Rachel's schedule, Rachel's feelings, while my own reason for calling sat completely unaddressed. When I finally gently tried to bring the conversation back to what I'd called about, my mother said, "Carmen, you've always been the strong one. You don't need me the way Rachel does." I hung up that phone and sat in silence in my apartment for a long time. I wasn't angry, not initially. I was simply finally clear. I understood that in my family, strength wasn't a compliment. It was a disqualifier. Being strong meant being told your needs didn't count because someone else's counted more permanently by default, regardless of circumstance. I made a decision that night that I didn't fully articulate until years later, but I lived it from that point forward. I decided I would keep showing up for major family events, keep being polite, keep being generous when I chose to be. But I would stop expecting equal treatment, equal curiosity, equal love from people who had already decided decades earlier exactly how much of each I was owed. I didn't storm out of anyone's life. I didn't send an angry letter. I just quietly, permanently adjusted what I expected, the same way I had at 9 years old when dance lessons weren't in the budget. Except this time at 27 I also adjusted something else. I stopped being quietly useful without acknowledgement. From that point forward, if I helped my family financially, I made absolutely sure my name was on every document, every contract, every signature line, whether anyone thought to thank me for it or not. I had no idea 5 years later exactly how important that habit was going to become. After that phone call, I threw myself into work with a focus I hadn't had before. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. I finally understood that nobody was going to hand me security, attention, or safety. I was going to have to build every bit of it myself, the same way I'd built that $300 envelope taped under my dresser drawer at 12 years old. I'd started my career in contract administration for a mid-sized commercial real estate firm in Charleston, reviewing lease agreements and vendor contracts for a portfolio of office buildings. It was detail-heavy, unglamorous work, exactly the kind most people found tedious. I found it satisfying in a way I struggled to explain to anyone. Every contract was a puzzle with a hidden trap somewhere inside it, a clause someone hoped you wouldn't read closely enough to catch. I read closely. I always read closely. Nobody had ever paid close enough attention to me, so I'd made a habit and eventually a career out of paying obsessive attention to everything else. Within 2 years, I'd moved into a specialized niche that most people in commercial contracts overlooked entirely: event and hospitality vendor agreements. Wedding venues, catering contracts, hotel block agreements, all the fine print buried in the kind of documents most families sign once in their lives without ever reading past the total at the bottom. I understood this world intimately, partly from my mother's old event planning business, and partly because I'd quietly helped negotiate my own sister's wedding contract 5 years earlier without anyone at the table ever asking how I'd learned to do that. By 29, I'd left the real estate firm and joined a boutique consulting practice in Charleston that specialized almost exclusively in event contract law and vendor dispute resolution, helping venues, caterers, and occasionally families themselves untangle disastrous wedding and event agreements before they escalated into lawsuits. It was a small, highly specialized field, and within it I built a genuine reputation fast. I had an eye for the exact clauses that caused the most damage: deposit forfeiture terms, force majeure loopholes, indemnification language that quietly shifted enormous financial liability onto whoever was naive enough not to negotiate it. By 30, I was named a senior partner at the firm, the youngest in its history. By 31, I'd handled over 200 event contracts personally, including several high-profile disputes that made regional business news when hotel chains tried to quietly overcharge or underdeliver on 6-figure wedding packages. I became known in a very specific and very useful corner of the hospitality industry, as the person you called when a contract had gone wrong and thousands of dollars were on the line. None of this made its way back to my family. I hadn't hidden it exactly. I simply stopped volunteering information nobody had ever shown real curiosity about. My mother knew vaguely that I did something with contracts. She never asked for specifics, and I stopped offering them, the same way I'd stopped mentioning honor roll certificates and academic program acceptances a decade and a half earlier. It wasn't bitterness, not entirely. It was just a boundary that had built itself gradually, the way boundaries often do when nobody on the other side has ever asked a real question. I bought a townhouse in downtown Charleston at 32, a beautifully restored single-family home on a quiet street near the water, 2 hours and a lifetime away from the house outside Savannah where I'd grown up. I furnished it slowly, deliberately, with things I actually wanted, no longer defaulting to whatever was left over after someone else's needs were met first. I traveled when I wanted. I dated when I wanted. I built a small, tight circle of close friends who asked me real questions and actually waited to hear the answers, something my own family had never quite mastered. My relationship with Rachel during these years was cordial but distant. We exchanged birthday texts, saw each other at the occasional holiday, but the closeness we might have had as sisters had eroded slowly over decades of unequal treatment neither of us had ever really discussed directly. I didn't blame Rachel for the imbalance. She hadn't built it. She'd simply been raised inside it the same way I had, just from a very different seat at the table. My mother, over these years, spoke to me maybe 6 or 7 times a year, mostly logistics-driven calls about holidays or occasionally, cautiously, asking small updates about my work that never went deeper than the surface. I'd stopped waiting for it to go deeper. I'd made peace mostly with a relationship that would likely always exist at that same careful distance. Then this past winter Rachel got engaged again. Her first marriage to Kyle had ended in a quiet divorce 3 years earlier, something the family rarely discussed openly. Her new fiancé, a kind, steady man named Marcus, worked in commercial insurance and came from a modest family in Atlanta. Rachel called me herself, which surprised me, genuinely excited, asking if I'd be willing to help review the venue contract for their wedding. A large, formal celebration planned for a historic estate venue just outside Savannah, budgeted at nearly $40,000 total. I said yes immediately. Not because I owed anyone anything. I said yes because Rachel had asked me directly, personally, in a way that felt, for once, like she actually wanted my specific expertise rather than assuming I'd simply comply because family required it. I reviewed the venue contract carefully over several evenings, caught 2 problematic clauses regarding deposit forfeiture and vendor substitution rights, negotiated better terms directly with the venue's event coordinator, and ultimately structured the payment schedule myself, in phases, tied to specific service milestones rather than a single upfront lump sum, which is standard best practice in my field and something almost no families ever think to request. Because I was the one who negotiated it, and because Rachel and my parents didn't fully understand the payment structure I'd built to protect them, my name ended up listed as the authorized contact and secondary signatory on the venue agreement, alongside Rachel's. It was a small, practical decision at the time, made purely for professional reasons, to ensure someone with contract expertise could intervene quickly if any dispute arose before the wedding. Nobody in my family thought much of it. I certainly didn't expect it to matter beyond the paperwork. I had no idea 6 weeks before the wedding exactly how much that single signature line was about to matter. 6 weeks before the wedding, my mother called with a request that, in hindsight, should have told me everything. She wanted to discuss seating logistics, and buried inside a 15-minute conversation about table arrangements was a single sentence I almost missed. "We're keeping the guest list really tight this time, Carmen. Rachel wants it intimate." I didn't think much of it. I assumed intimate meant smaller, not that it meant me. The truth came out 2 weeks later, at a family lunch I'd driven 2 hours to attend, the same kind of lunch where, 5 years earlier, my mother had told me I made everything about myself. My mother waited until we were nearly finished eating before she said it. not quite meeting my eyes, the same way she hadn't quite met my eyes over dance lessons 20 years before. "Carmen, we think it's best if you don't come to the wedding." I set my fork down slowly. "I'm sorry, what?" My mother glanced at my father, who suddenly found his water glass extremely interesting. "It's nothing personal," she continued. "Rachel and Marcus want a very specific curated guest list, close friends and immediate family only, and given some of the tension over the years between you two, we think it's just easier this way. Cleaner." Tension between us. I almost laughed. There had been no tension between Rachel and me. There had been decades of tension between me and this family's definition of who deserved a seat at the table. And somehow, once again, I was the one being asked to absorb the consequence of it quietly. "I negotiated her venue contract," I said, my voice flat, careful. "I caught 2 clauses that would have cost her family thousands of dollars if something went wrong. I structured the entire payment schedule. And now I'm not invited to the wedding." My mother's jaw tightened. "We're grateful for your help, Carmen, we really are. This isn't about that. It's about keeping the day simple for your sister." I looked at Rachel, who I only then realized had come to this lunch too, sitting quietly at the end of the table, not meeting my eyes either. "Rachel," I said, "is this what you want?" She hesitated just long enough for me to have my answer before she even spoke. "Mom and I talked about it," she said carefully. "I think it's just easier this way for everyone." I didn't argue. I didn't cry, not there at the table, not in front of them. I felt something colder settle into place instead, something calm and clear, the same clarity I'd felt years earlier sitting alone in my apartment after my mother told me I didn't need her the way Rachel did. I nodded once, said, "Understood," finished my water and left 20 minutes later without raising my voice a single time. "I want to be honest with you about something." In that moment I made a decision I don't regret, but that I also didn't make out of anger. I decided I would not fight to attend a wedding where my own family had just told me plainly that my presence was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be welcomed. What I did decide quietly in the 2 weeks that followed was that I would simply stop actively managing a contract for people who just told me I wasn't wanted in the room where that contract would be executed. I didn't cancel anything. I didn't sabotage anything. I want to be extremely clear about that because what happened next wasn't revenge. It was simply the natural, entirely predictable consequence of removing myself from a role I'd never been formally released from. Here's what almost none of my family understood about the contract I'd negotiated. Because of the deposit forfeiture and vendor substitution issues I'd caught during my review, I'd structured the payment schedule in 3 separate milestone releases rather than a single lump sum, an industry standard protection I use on nearly every event contract I handle. The final and largest release, roughly $38,000 covering the venue balance, full catering and several key vendors, required a secondary authorization signature to process, precisely the safeguard I'd built in specifically to prevent any single party from being financially exposed without oversight. That secondary signature line had my name on it, because I was the contract expert who'd requested it, back when everyone still wanted my involvement. Nobody had ever formally removed me from that role. Nobody had thought to. In the chaos of uninviting me to the wedding, apparently nobody on the planning side circled back to the actual legal mechanics of the contract I'd built to protect them. 3 days before the wedding, the venue's finance office reached out, per standard procedure, to confirm the final milestone authorization before releasing the balance to vendors. They reached out to both signatories on file. Rachel authorized her portion within the hour. My authorization simply never came, because nobody had told me the wedding was even proceeding on schedule, and I certainly hadn't been checking my email obsessively for updates on an event I'd been explicitly excluded from. The wedding happened. I want to be clear about that too. Rachel and Marcus got married exactly as planned on a beautiful estate outside Savannah, on the date they'd chosen, in front of the guest list my mother had curated without me on it. I found out later from a cousin who wasn't shy about details, that it had, by all accounts, been a lovely ceremony. What Rachel and my parents didn't fully grasp until the Monday after the wedding was that the venue, per the contract terms I'd negotiated specifically to protect against exactly this kind of gap, had frozen the final $38,000 disbursement pending the missing secondary authorization. Vendors, the caterer, the florist, the band, the venue itself, had performed services over the weekend expecting standard payment processing to follow within 72 hours, as outlined in the contract. Instead, because one required signature was missing, every one of those vendors was now waiting on payment that legally could not be released without my authorization. My mother called me the following Monday, 3 days after the wedding I hadn't attended. I saw her name flash on my phone 11 times over the course of that afternoon, each call closer together than the last, each one landing in the middle of a workday where I was, coincidentally, reviewing an entirely unrelated vendor contract for a hotel chain in Atlanta. I let every single call go to voicemail. Not out of cruelty. I want you to understand that clearly. I let those calls go to voicemail because I genuinely did not yet know what they were calling about. I assumed, honestly, it was a delayed apology or perhaps photos from the wedding, or some other small gesture meant to smooth over the exclusion. It wasn't until the 11th call and the accompanying voicemail, breathless and increasingly desperate, that I understood exactly what had happened, and exactly why my signature, the one nobody had thought to formally remove from a contract for a wedding I wasn't invited to, suddenly mattered more to my family than it had in 32 years. I sat in my office in Charleston listening to that voicemail twice, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel invisible. I felt, for the first time in this entire relationship, absolutely necessary. I finally called my mother back that evening, once I'd had time to review the contract file myself and understand precisely what leverage I did and didn't actually have. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened next. I never once considered letting the vendors go unpaid indefinitely, or letting my sister's marriage begin under the shadow of an unresolved financial mess. That was never who I was going to be in this story. But I also wasn't going to pretend the last 3 days hadn't happened, or that I owed anyone an immediate silent fix simply because the word family had suddenly become urgently important again. My mother picked up before the first ring finished. "Carmen, thank God. We have a huge problem." "I heard your voicemail," I said calmly. "Several of them, actually. The venue is saying they can't release the final payment without your signature," she said, talking fast, the panic barely contained. "The caterer is threatening legal action if they're not paid by Friday. The florist already called Rachel directly. Carmen, this is a disaster. We need you to authorize it right now." "I understand it's urgent," I said. "I built that authorization requirement myself, actually. It's a fairly standard protection in event contracts this size, to prevent exactly this kind of situation, where a large sum gets released without proper oversight." There was a pause. "So you can just fix it? Tonight?" "I can review it," I said. "But before I do, I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. 3 days ago I wasn't welcome at that wedding. Tonight, apparently, my signature is the only thing standing between your family and a legal mess with 4 different vendors. I'd like to understand how those 2 things exist in the same family in the same week." My mother's voice shifted, defensive now. "Carmen, this isn't the time to relitigate the guest list. Vendors are threatening legal action. We need this handled." "I hear that," I said. "And I will handle it. I'm not going to let Rachel's vendors go unpaid, or let her marriage start with a legal dispute hanging over it. That's not who I am, and it never has been. But I want to be honest with you about something else too. I'm not going to pretend the last 3 weeks didn't happen just because tonight it's convenient for me to." I asked her to put Rachel on the phone. There was some shuffling, some muffled conversation I wasn't meant to hear, and then Rachel's voice, smaller than I expected. "Carmen, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize the payment was tied to your signature specifically. I thought it was just standard processing." "It was standard processing," I said. The safeguard I built in required a secondary authorization on any release over $10,000, precisely because that protects everyone involved from exactly this kind of vendor dispute. Nobody removed me from that role when you decided I shouldn't be at the wedding. I don't think anyone thought about the contract at all, honestly, once the guest list conversation started. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Are you going to authorize it? I'm going to review the vendor invoices first tonight, to make sure everything billed matches what was actually contracted and delivered, I said. That's not me being difficult. That's literally the entire point of the safeguard, and it's exactly what I'd do for any client in this situation. I'd expect it to take about an hour. I spent the next hour doing precisely that, cross-referencing every line item against the original contract I'd negotiated months earlier. And I found, unsurprisingly, given how often this happens in the industry, one significant discrepancy. The catering company had billed for a cocktail hour upgrade, a raw bar station, that wasn't included in the original contract and that, according to the actual event coordinator I called directly to confirm, had never actually been delivered at the wedding. It was a fairly common tactic, tacking an unauthorized add-on onto a final invoice and hoping nobody with contract expertise was checking closely before payment released. $640 sitting quietly in a $38,000 total, easy to miss if you weren't specifically trained to look for it. I called my mother back. There's a $640 charge for a service that wasn't delivered. I'm going to dispute that with the caterer directly before authorizing anything, which is standard practice and will likely take a short conversation tomorrow morning. Once that's resolved, I'll release the corrected amount. Carmen, can't you just pay it and deal with the $600 later? The vendors are threatening. I can, but I'm not going to, I said, and for the first time in that entire conversation, my voice had an edge to it that I let stay there. I built a safeguard specifically to catch discrepancies like this, the same way I did at a family dinner over an oyster bill a while back. Actually, funny enough. I'm not going to abandon good practice just because it's inconvenient for people who told me 3 weeks ago that my presence complicated things. If anything, I think you should be relieved someone caught this before $38,000 went out the door with an error buried inside it. I called the catering company the next morning, calmly and professionally, exactly the way I would for any client, and within 20 minutes the charge was removed and the invoice corrected. I authorized the release of the corrected final payment that same afternoon. The vendors were paid in full on time with the actual services rendered, no more and no less. Rachel and Marcus's marriage began without a single unresolved dollar hanging over it. But I wasn't finished. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I finally, for the first time in 32 years, had something I'd never had in this family before. Their full, undivided attention freely given because they needed something from me. I called a family meeting, if you can call 4 people on a video call a meeting, 2 days later. My mother, my father, and Rachel all joined, none of them entirely sure what I wanted to discuss, since the money had already been resolved. I want to say something and I only want to say it once, I told them. I am genuinely glad Rachel's wedding went well, and I'm glad I could help make sure the vendors were paid correctly and fairly. I would do that again, honestly, regardless of the guest list, because that's simply who I am. But I need all 3 of you to sit with something. 3 weeks ago, I wasn't important enough to be in the room. 3 days ago, I was suddenly the only person who could fix a $38,000 emergency. Both of those things happened in the same month in the same family, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's a pattern I've been living inside since I was 9 years old and dance lessons weren't in the budget. My father spoke for the first time in the entire conversation quietly. You're right, Carmen. I should have said something when your mother told you not to come. I didn't, and I've regretted it every day since the wedding. My mother didn't say much. She looked, for the first time in this entire story, genuinely uncertain of herself. A woman who'd spent 32 years assuming my usefulness and my belonging were entirely separate questions, only to discover rather abruptly that I'd stopped agreeing to that arrangement. I'm not asking any of you to grovel. I said. I'm asking you to understand that you don't get to decide I'm inconvenient one month and essential the next, without me having something to say about which version of that relationship I'm actually willing to keep showing up for. Nobody argued with me. Not even my mother. I want to tell you honestly, this story didn't end with a dramatic reconciliation scene, and it also didn't end with me cutting my family off completely. It ended somewhere quieter and more complicated than either of those things, which I think is closer to how these situations actually resolve in real life, even if it's not always the most satisfying ending to hear. In the weeks after that video call, my father called me directly on his own without my mother initiating it for the first time in years. He asked about my work genuinely, in a way that went beyond the surface-level questions I'd grown used to. He asked what exactly I'd caught in that catering invoice, how I'd known to look for it, what my day-to-day work actually involved. I told him, and I could hear for the first time real curiosity in his voice, not the polite, distracted curiosity I'd learned to expect, but something closer to genuine interest in who I'd actually become. It didn't erase 20 years of being an afterthought at that dinner table. But it mattered. I let it matter. Rachel and I talked more, 2 longer conversations than we'd had in years. She admitted, eventually, that agreeing to the guest list decision was one of the things she regretted most about her wedding, even though the day itself had been beautiful. I let Mom's version of easier win, she told me, instead of asking what was actually right. I appreciated her saying it, and I told her so honestly. I also told her that an apology didn't erase the pattern, it just acknowledged it, and that the two of us actually building a real relationship on equal footing was going to take more than one honest phone call after a financial emergency forced everyone's hand. She agreed. We're working on it, slowly, in a way that finally doesn't feel entirely one-directional. My mother's response has been the most complicated. She's apologized more than once in ways that sound sincere in the moment. But I've also noticed old patterns resurface here and there, small comments about how sensitive I've become, or how I make things harder than they need to be, the same language she used when I was 27 and grieving a breakup she didn't have time for. I don't think my mother is a villain in this story, any more than Rachel is, or Palmer was in a different story I told a while back. I think my mother is a person who built a family dynamic decades ago that worked well enough for her, and who is only now, reluctantly, being asked to examine whether it ever actually worked for me. That's a slow, uncomfortable process, and I've had to accept that it might not fully resolve in the way I'd want it to, no matter how many corrected invoices or honest conversations we have. Here's what I want to say clearly to you watching this right now. For most of my life, my worth and my family existed in exactly 2 states: convenient enough to be quietly useful or inconvenient enough to be excluded. There was no version of me that simply got to exist fully welcome without first proving I deserved the seat. I spent decades believing that was simply how family worked, that love had to be earned through usefulness, and that being asked to disappear was just the cost of occasionally being needed. I don't believe that anymore. I authorized that $38,000 payment because I genuinely didn't want my sister's marriage to begin with unpaid vendors and legal threats hanging over it, and because catching a billing error and protecting people from financial harm is, quite literally, the work I've built my entire career around. I would do it again honestly regardless of any guest list. But I also made sure for the first time in my life that helping didn't mean disappearing again the moment the crisis passed. I said what I needed to say. I didn't let anyone rush past it just because the money had already cleared. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. You are allowed to be both generous and honest at the same time. You are allowed to help the people who excluded you and still tell them clearly that the exclusion happened, and that it mattered, and that helping them doesn't erase it. Those 2 things are not in conflict. For a long time I thought I had to choose between being the reliable one and being the one who spoke up. I don't think that's true anymore. I think the version of me that finally caught a $600 discrepancy on a wedding invoice is the same version of me that finally, calmly, told her own mother the truth about a pattern 32 years in the making. Both of those came from the same place. paying close attention to numbers and to myself because for a long time nobody else was going to do it for me. I still live in Charleston in the townhouse I bought for myself on a quiet street near the water. I still catch discrepancies in contracts almost weekly, because once you learn to notice when something doesn't add up, you genuinely can't unlearn it in any room at any table for the rest of your life. And I still show up for my family when I choose to, on terms I actually agreed to, instead of terms that were simply handed to me because I'd always accepted them quietly before. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been told you were too much in one breath and not enough in the next, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and tell me about a moment when you finally stopped disappearing quietly. I read every single comment, and whatever your version of that wedding invitation was, I promise you, you are not alone in it. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.